Hello and welcome to the fifth and final lecture of the fifth and final week of the Open University's MOOC on genocide. Today we continue to discuss the annihilation of the Native American population in North America during the 19th century under the rule of the United States. In the previous lecture I told you about two conflicting approaches among the US political leadership throughout the 19th century. One approach called for the civilization and integration, at least to a certain extent, of the Native American population into the United States population. The other, ethnocentric approach became more dominant from 1830 onwards, calling for the removal of the Native Americans from the areas populated by whites and totally rejecting the idea of integrating the Native Americans into the United States population. This dominant approach gains popularity in the 40s and 50s of the 19th century, culminating during the Civil War and even later in the Plains War, eventually becoming the prevailing attitude that sets the agenda. It ultimately dooms the fate of the Native Americans, so much so that in 1890 the number within the US amounts to 250,000 only. Before we talk about the Civil War and the Plains War, I'll briefly review the actions of the federal government towards the Native Americans in the 40s and 50s of the 19th century. In 1846, a war breaks out between the US and Mexico. The United States wins the war, which ends in 1848, and the spoils of this war are massive. The annexation of several large territories by the United States. The states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California all become part of the federal United States after that war. At the end of that war, huge deposits of gold are discovered in California. This sets the stage for the famous gold rush and the arrival of massive amounts of immigrants from Europe who believe they'll arrive in California and get rich instantly by digging large amounts of gold without hindrance. Of course, that isn't the case. Only a handful of immigrants actually become rich. But those who suffer as a result of this unplanned and undesired mass of immigrants deep into the western United States are of course the Native Americans, who are treated by the immigrants from Europe as pests or animals, surely not humans, undeserving of any compassion or respect. In addition, we also see a wholesale destruction of the ecological balance during that period. I will illustrate this point with one notable example. Vast herds of millions of buffalo used to live in the wild in the Midwest of the United States. These herds would migrate over vast territories and many Native Americans made a living off them. Entire nations depended on and lived by the migratory route of the buffalo. They would simply follow and hunt buffalo, eat the flesh, and use the skin for tents and clothing. At one point in the mid-19th century, the US federal government decides that these huge herds of buffalo are an environmental hazard that must be stopped quickly. This is also related to the later vast project of laying the transatlantic railway tracks from the East Coast to the West Coast, which was hindered by these migrating herds. So the decision is made to eliminate all those millions of buffalo. Besides the tremendous tragedy in itself, this elimination also causes an environmental disaster for the Native Americans who up until then depended on those vast herds of buffalo for food. I could give many more examples, but I think the point is clear and understood. We have an encounter between two civilizations. One Western civilization that believes in technology, progress, and modernity, the civilization of the United States in the 19th century. And on the other hand, a civilization of the original native inhabitants of North America who maintain the traditional way of life and want to continue doing so even though they are constantly pushed by the United States to the West. The elimination of the buffalo is a striking example of the conflict created by such an encounter between two civilizations, each of which sees reality through the lens of its own exclusive interests. During the American Civil War of 1861 to 1865, a terrible war that claims the lives of nearly 600,000 US citizens, several major Native American nations make strong alliance with the Confederacy, which ends up losing the war. We don't know exactly what occurred at the end of that war. We only know that many Native American villages that existed in the area of the fighting were gone by the time of the bloody 4-year war was over. That is contrary to the accepted rules of war under which the North should have been satisfied that the Native American fighters who fought alongside the forces of the South were defeated by the North. But apparently, during those victories over the Native American forces, an expulsion took place at best, or a full-fledged extermination at worst. We do not have any evidence of that. There is no military order that talks about that, or presidential decree that clearly defines the need to clear out the Native Americans. But in reality, the areas settled by hundreds of Native American communities were cleared of their presence after the war, so you can draw your own conclusions. At the end of the Civil War in the late 60s and 70s of the 19th century, a series of famous battles called the Plains War takes place. These wars are actually waged to end the autonomous hold of various Native American nations of the last remaining territory under their rule in the northwestern region of the United States, in particular the area known as the Great Plains. For several years, the United States Army, battle-hardened after the Civil War, fights and quenches the last military efforts of the Native American nations. During that series of battles, we see quite a few interesting statements made by the most senior generals of the US Army, candidly expressing their views on the fate of the Native Americans and stating what should be done with them. I cite, for example, a quote from famous General Sherman, who unknowingly gave his name to the American-made tank later on in the 20th century. Sherman says during the Plains Wars, "We must act decisively and take revenge against the Sioux," that is the name of the Native American nation, "to the point of extinction of men, women, and children. Nothing else will touch the root of the problem. We must infiltrate deep within the midst and kill many of them to instill fear and then lead the remaining to places where US federal agents can handle their behavior." End of quote. I'll quote one more general and another statement to illustrate the situation. Another top general in the US Army at the time, Ulysses S. Grant, whose name you may have heard, he later became President of the United States, of course, says the following during the Plains Wars: "Clear the plains for the new white settlers, even if it necessitates the elimination of all the Native American tribes." End of quote. One final quote just to portray the atmosphere within the United States Army during that war. Senior General Philip Sheridan says the following: "If a Native American village is attacked and women and children are killed, the responsibility does not lie with the US soldiers, but with the people, namely the Native Americans, whose crimes necessitated the attack." Such quotes indicate that Native American women and children were indeed eliminated by the United States Army as a common practice. Otherwise, that kind of statement would not be necessary. It's true that only a few generals spoke in such a way, and it doesn't mean this was genocide. This may have been the jargon we often see in the military during the war, which perhaps is natural for motivating a combat spirit among troops. And yet, I think these quotes I just read to you speak for themselves and are quite striking. Today, we still cannot clearly determine what exactly happened during the 19th century and what caused the disappearance of millions of Native Americans. It's practically yesterday, right? It's the 19th century, not the 16th century, which we discussed in the prior lectures on the Spanish domination of Latin America. This is the 19th century. We already have a growing community of United States citizens, albeit white, who are establishing a modern state. And towards the second half of that century, they already have a media and press, at least to a certain extent. There are reports, there is literature, there are universities. This is supposed to be a civilized and democratic society, and yet, in the course of that century, this great annihilation or extinction of the Native American population living in the United States apparently takes place. There are quite a few theories and stories, including well-known stories you may have heard about white settlers deliberately exposing Native Americans to blankets infected with smallpox, for example. The truth is, there is no evidence of that, certainly not hard proof. Some researchers still believe it and continue to present these theories. Others claim this is nonsense, and that even if there were several isolated attempts to intentionally infect Native Americans with diseases imported from Europe, this was not official policy. And indeed, it seems it was not. Native Americans also died of disease, no doubt, like their brethren in South America, who were not naturally immune to a variety of diseases brought from Europe, such as the flu and other childhood diseases like chickenpox, or even worse, smallpox. The North American natives also encounter the same diseases, and indeed many of them die as a result. However, the North American natives lived a mostly traditional nomadic lifestyle in the outdoors. They were not enclosed in small and cramped settlements or behind walls. No one locked them in cages as forced laborers, unlike the natives of South America, and therefore their mortality rates were lesser compared to the epidemics in South America. There are other different causes for the mortality among native North Americans, such as severe alcoholism, as well as the destruction of the ecological balance I described earlier. But ultimately, it is difficult to estimate how millions of Native Americans disappear from the face of the earth just like that. And even though we have no real proof, it sometimes seems that the theory of genocide requires further research and attention, since it may be grounded in reality. The scholars of our time do not agree on the issue. Some talk about genocide, and others talk about a host of simultaneous scenarios resulting with only 250,000 Native Americans remaining in US territory in 1890 out of an estimated 6 to 10 million in the last quarter of the 18th century. That's it for today, the last lecture in our final lecture week. Thank you and goodbye.